The smell hit me before consciousness fully returned. Burnt promethium mixed with something sweeter, organic, like roasted meat left too long over flames. I opened my eyes to smoke so thick it had texture, grey coils drifting through the command bunker's emergency lighting, and knew immediately that Lieutenant Markov was dead because his standing order had been to seal all ventilation ducts at the first sign of enemy contact. The smoke meant the ducts were open, which meant someone had countermanded his order, which meant Markov had either complied or been overruled, and either way he was certainly dead now because everyone who followed orders died first. I was Sergeant Kyle Torrens, 3rd Year Infantry, assigned to Forward Operating Position Gamma 7, on a world whose official designation I'd never learned, and whose local name was unpronounceable by human tongues. We'd been holding this position for 8 months, a fortified bunker complex guarding a supply route that fed 3 mechanized divisions operating 200 kilometers to the north. The enemy, Xenos, specifically the kind with too many limbs and an incomprehensible approach to tactics, had been testing our perimeter for weeks, probing attacks that followed no recognizable pattern, appearing at random intervals from random directions, always withdrawing before we could inflict significant casualties. Command had sent increasingly specific orders about how to respond to these probes: maintain defensive positions, do not pursue, conserve ammunition, report all contact through proper channels, wait for reinforcement before any offensive action. Standard doctrine, sensible protocol, the kind of orders that had kept the Empire's armies functional across 10,000 years of constant warfare. Lieutenant Markov had implemented every directive with textbook precision, color-coding duty rosters, establishing clear chains of communication, ensuring that every soldier understood their role and their limitations. The first to die had been Corporal Venn, who'd been manning the eastern observation post when the enemy had appeared 3 weeks ago, in a formation that looked almost like a religious procession. Command's standing order was to report unusual enemy behavior and await tactical guidance before engaging. Venn had followed protocol perfectly, voxing his observation to the command bunker, describing the strange procession in detail, requesting permission to fire. While he waited for authorization, something in that procession had noticed him. We found his body still at his post, his eyes liquefied in their sockets, his hands frozen around the Vox receiver that had never transmitted the authorization he'd needed. Next was Private Kellis, who'd been on ammunition inventory duty when Command issued a directive about conserving high-explosive rounds for confirmed enemy armor encounters. She'd meticulously recategorized our munitions according to the new priority system, moving the armor-piercing ordnance to the primary storage bay and relegating the fragmentation rounds to secondary storage. That night, the enemy had breached our perimeter through a drainage culvert, no armor, just light infantry equivalents that fragmentation rounds would have shredded efficiently. Kellis had run to secondary storage following proper procedure, unlocking the access doors, pulling the authorization codes from her data slate. They'd found her halfway there, her body opened from sternum to groin with surgical precision, her data slate still clutched in her hand, its screen displaying the correct authorization sequence for accessing restricted munitions. Lieutenant Markov had held a briefing after that, reminding us that discipline was what separated Imperial soldiers from rabble, that orders existed for reasons beyond our individual comprehension, that doubt was the first step toward damnation. He'd been eloquent, passionate, his faith in the chain of command absolute. I'd watched the other. Soldiers nodding, absorbing his conviction, their faces showing the relief that comes from surrendering personal judgment to institutional authority. I'd nodded too, because disagreement was itself a violation, but I'd felt something cold settling in my stomach, a recognition that had no words yet, but was trying to form itself into understanding. The pattern had continued with terrible consistency. Sergeant Brandt, ordered to maintain radio silence during a 48-hour communications blackout, meant to deny the enemy intelligence about our force disposition. He'd followed the order perfectly, had enforced it on his squad, had confiscated their Vox units and locked them in the communications room. When the enemy had attacked his position, he'd had no way to call for support, no way to coordinate with adjacent units, and by the time the blackout ended, we'd found his entire squad butchered, their bodies arranged in patterns that suggested the enemy had taken considerable time with them, methodical and unhurried, working in silence that our own protocols had guaranteed. Private First Class Morvan, who'd been ordered to maintain her sentry position for a full 12-hour shift, despite reporting unusual movement in the tree line, command had responded that proper discipline required completing assigned duties regardless of perceived threats, that reporting was sufficient, that abandoning posts created gaps in our defensive coverage. She'd stayed at her post like a good soldier, had continued reporting the movement through proper channels, and something had emerged from that tree line and taken her piece by piece, slowly enough that her final Vox transmission was a sound I still hear when I try to sleep, a wet screaming that had syllables but no longer qualified as language. Each death had been followed by an investigation, a review of procedures, a determination that the deceased had acted appropriately within their authority, and that their loss, while regrettable, did not indicate systematic failure of doctrine. The reports always concluded with the same essential message: the orders had been correct, the execution had been proper, and the outcome, though tragic, reflected the fundamental unpredictability of warfare rather than any flaw in command structure. But I'd been keeping my own count, my own analysis, and the numbers told a story that the official reports refused to acknowledge. Soldiers who followed orders precisely, 17 dead in 3 weeks. Soldiers who'd shown initiative, improvised, violated protocol, 3 wounded, 0 dead. The correlation was undeniable once you looked for it, once you stopped filtering observations through the assumption that orders were inherently correct. The smell in the bunker was intensifying, the burnt meat sweetness mixing now with something acrid that stung my sinuses and made my eyes water. I pulled myself upright from where I'd been thrown by whatever explosion had knocked me unconscious, assessed my condition through the systematic inventory they drilled into us during training: extremities functional, no major bleeding, vision clearing, hearing returning as a high-pitched whine that gradually resolved into distant sounds of weapons fire and screaming. My rifle was still slung across my chest, 1 magazine remaining, the weapon's safety somehow still engaged despite the violence that had torn through this space. Bodies littered the command bunker's floor. I counted 6 before stopping, recognizing Lieutenant Markov by his officer's insignia and the peculiar way his neck bent, the spine visible through torn flesh, his face frozen in an expression of absolute betrayal, as if his death had been a violation of some contract he'd believed was binding. The others I didn't examine closely, didn't want to know their names or their stories, couldn't afford the weight of that recognition when I was trying to calculate my own survival. The command board was still functional, its displays showing the tactical situation in glowing green wireframes and red enemy position markers. The markers were everywhere, had penetrated our perimeter at 7 different points, were moving through the complex with coordinated purpose that suggested they'd somehow obtained our defensive plans, knew exactly where every strong point was located, were bypassing fortified positions and striking at support infrastructure and communication nodes. As I watched, 3 friendly position markers went dark in sequence: Observation Post 4, the motor pool, the medical bay, each disappearing with the clean finality of a light switching off. The Vox unit crackled, a transmission breaking through on the emergency frequency, All units, this is Battalion Command. You are ordered to withdraw to Rally Point Epsilon and establish defensive positions for counterattack. I repeat, all units withdraw to Rally Point Epsilon immediately. Acknowledge by unit designation. Rally Point Epsilon was a killing ground, a flat clearing 400 meters northwest of our current position, zero cover, complete exposure from the ridgeline, where the enemy had established their advanced positions. Moving there would put every surviving soldier in a perfectly targeted zone where enemy fire could achieve maximum efficiency. I stared at the Vox unit, waiting for other units to acknowledge, counting the seconds and the silence until finally one voice responded, "Command, this is Sergeant Halvan, 3rd Platoon. Rally Point Epsilon is compromised. We are observing enemy positions with clear firing solutions on that location. Request alternate rally coordinates." Negative, Sergeant Halvan. You are ordered to Rally Point Epsilon. Battalion Command out. I waited, listening to the Vox's empty hiss, wondering how many other soldiers were doing the same calculation I was doing, how many were recognizing that compliance meant death, how many had the clarity to choose survival over obedience. The Vox remained silent, except for the occasional burst of static and distant screaming. No acknowledgements, no confirmations, just the void of soldiers who'd learned that following orders was lethal. The smell was changing again, the burnt meat sweetness fading and being replaced by something else, something chemical and wrong, like the air itself was spoiling. I checked my rebreather, found it damaged, the seals broken, useless. Whatever was contaminating the atmosphere would reach my lungs unfiltered, and I had no idea what it would do once it got there, what the enemy had introduced into our enclosed spaces, what creative horror they'd engineered specifically for targets that followed doctrine and sealed themselves in fortified positions. I needed to leave the bunker, needed to reach surface level and open air, needed to put distance between myself and whatever was happening in this compound. But leaving meant violating standing orders, meant abandoning my post, meant committing the kind of insubordination that resulted in summary execution if I survived long enough to be caught. The calculation was simple: certain death here following orders, probable death out there violating them, possible survival if I could move fast enough and think clearly enough to avoid both the enemy and my own command structure. I chose survival, pushed myself upright, and moved toward the bunker's emergency exit, a narrow stairwell that led up through 3 levels of reinforced concrete to a concealed hatch in the surface. The stairs were dark, emergency lighting failed or deliberately disabled, and I climbed by touch, my rifle held ready, expecting ambush at every turn. The chemical smell intensified as I ascended, suggesting it was being pumped in from above, settling downward through the complex, filling the lowest levels first where the command staff had positioned themselves in the most fortified, most protected, most trapped locations. I emerged into night air that felt clean despite the distant fires, and smoke, into a compound that had been transformed into something resembling an abattoir, bodies scattered in configurations that suggested they'd been killed while maintaining formation, while holding assigned positions, while waiting for orders that never came or came too late. The enemy was still present. I could hear their movement, but they seemed focused on the central bunkers, on the locations where soldiers would have concentrated according to defensive doctrine, where command posts and rally points and fortified positions created convenient, target-rich environments. I moved toward the perimeter, keeping to shadows, avoiding the main pathways, using every piece of cover terrain provided rather than the prepared defensive positions that were obvious and therefore lethal. I passed Private Gorin's body near the communications trench. He'd been ordered to maintain Vox relay contact with Battalion Command. had stayed at his post broadcasting updates until something had found him and removed his head with enough force to embed it in the trench wall 3 meters away, his body still sitting upright at the Vox station, hands positioned as if still operating controls. The perimeter fence had been breached in multiple locations, the wire cut precisely, the gaps wide enough for easy passage. I chose one at random, slipped through, and found myself in the wasteland beyond our compound, a landscape of chemical residue and blasted vegetation that extended for kilometers in every direction. The sounds of combat were fading behind me, replaced by other sounds, clicks and rustles that might have been whined through dead plants or might have been something tracking my movement. I walked northwest, away from Rally Point Epsilon, away from the compound, away from any location where command would expect soldiers to gather. The night was absolutely black, no moon, no stars visible through the atmospheric pollution, navigation by compass and instinct, and the desperate hope that distance alone might constitute safety. Dawn arrived with the suddenness of a switch being thrown, the sun breaching the horizon and revealing a wasteland that extended further than I'd realized, a blasted plain where nothing organic remained except the scattered patches of something that might have been fungus or might have been alien vegetation, purple-gray masses that pulsed with faint bioluminescence. I'd walked perhaps 8 kilometers, far enough that the compound was invisible behind me, far enough that I should have felt safe or at least safer, but the smell had followed me, that chemical wrongness that suggested the enemy's weapon wasn't confined to the compound, was spreading through the atmosphere with patient inevitability. I found a crater, a depression in the ground perhaps 3 meters deep, and settled into it for rest and assessment. My supplies were minimal. 1 magazine of ammunition, 3 days of rations, a canteen of water, a medical kit, no Vox unit, no way to contact any survivors, no way to receive orders even if I'd wanted them. I was effectively deserter now, had abandoned my post during combat, had violated every article of military conduct that governs soldier behavior in hostile situations. The Empire's punishment for desertion was public execution, usually by firing squad, sometimes by more creative means depending on the commander's disposition and the availability of ecclesiastical authorities who believed that death should be instructive as well as punitive. I'd watched deserters executed during training, had learned the lesson that obedience was survival and disobedience was death, had internalized the logic that made following orders synonymous with preserving one's existence. But that logic had inverted itself on this world, in this campaign, during these weeks where the enemy had somehow learned to weaponize our own doctrine against us, to transform our discipline into a targeting system that identified and eliminated soldiers, precisely according to their compliance with military protocol. The better you followed orders, the faster you died. Perfect soldiers were perfect targets. I must have slept despite myself, because I woke to voices, human voices speaking Imperial Gothic with the clipped precision of officer-grade education. I pressed myself flat in the crater's bottom, controlled my breathing, listened as 3 figures moved past perhaps 20 meters away, their conversation clearly audible in the wasteland's dead silence. Battalion confirms Rally Point Epsilon was completely overrun. 93 confirmed casualties, no survivors recovered. The enemy anticipated the withdrawal order, had positioned heavy weapons with direct sight lines on the rally coordinates. How did they know? Are we compromised? Is there a breach in our communications? Intelligence believes they're using our own doctrine against us. Every order we issue becomes predictable to an enemy that's studied Imperial tactical manuals. They know where we'll concentrate forces, how we'll establish defensive positions, what our response protocols require. They're not fighting us, they're fighting our regulations. That's impossible. Doctrine exists because it's effective. 10,000 years of warfare have refined these procedures. Some Xenos rabble can't simply ignore. They're not ignoring it. They're exploiting it. Every unit that follows standard protocol becomes a fixed target. Every soldier that waits for orders before acting gives them time to maneuver. Discipline is killing us faster than their weapons. The voices faded as the figures moved on, heading northeast toward what I assumed was a fallback position, another coordinate on a map where Command expected survivors to gather. Another target zone waiting to be exploited. I waited until I could no longer hear their footsteps, then climbed out of the crater and moved in the opposite direction, southwest, toward terrain that looked even more hostile, but had the advantage of being somewhere no doctrine would suggest as appropriate for military operations. The wasteland became worse as I traveled, the chemical contamination more obvious, pools of liquid that had colors nature never intended, surfaces that looked solid but gave way into hidden pits filled with substances that would dissolve flesh on contact. I navigated carefully, testing each step, avoiding anything that looked too smooth or too regular, learning the vocabulary of this poisoned landscape through trial and near-fatal error. I found others eventually, survivors who'd made the same calculations I had, who'd chosen insubordination over suicide. We found each other through mutual caution, each of us armed and expecting hostility, lowering weapons only when we recognized the particular exhaustion and paranoia that marked soldiers who'd watched their comrades die for following orders. There were 11 of us initially. 9 infantry, 1 combat engineer, 1 medical orderly, none officers, no one from command staff, just ground soldiers who'd possessed either the intelligence or the cowardice to recognize that doctrine had become death. We didn't introduce ourselves by name, didn't establish rank hierarchy, didn't attempt to recreate military structure. We were deserters, survivors, refugees from an army that was being systematically destroyed by its own discipline. The combat engineer, a woman with burn scars covering half her face, outlined our situation with brutal clarity. The enemy has studied us. They know how we think, how we organize, how we respond to threats. Every standard tactical response is pre-targeted. Every rally point is a kill zone. Every fortified position is a trap. Command keeps issuing orders that make sense according to doctrine, but result in massacres because the enemy has doctrine memorized. So we're finished, someone said. If we can't follow orders, we're just rabble. If we do follow orders, we're corpses. We're finished if we stay predictable, the engineer replied. We survive by doing what no imperial soldier should do. We improvise, we operate independently. We make decisions without authorization. We become unreadable to an enemy that's learned to read us perfectly. It was heresy, fundamentally and explicitly heresy, the kind of tactical philosophy that resulted in court-martial and execution. Military effectiveness required hierarchy, chain of command, unified doctrine. Soldiers who acted independently were liabilities, introduced chaos into operations that demanded coordination. Everything we'd been trained to believe, everything that made the Empire's armies functional across thousands of worlds, said that this approach was suicide. But we'd watched what happened to soldiers who followed that training, who maintained that belief. We'd seen perfect obedience result in perfect slaughter. We moved as a group without being a unit, spread out enough that no single attack could eliminate all of us, close enough to provide mutual support, heading generally southwest without specific destination because having a destination would make us predictable. We encountered enemy patrols twice, avoided them both times through basic caution rather than tactical doctrine, surviving because we weren't where military logic said we should be. On the third day, we found another group of survivors, larger than ours, perhaps 30 soldiers who gathered around a captain who was attempting to maintain command structure and military discipline. He'd established a defensive perimeter, assigned guard duties. created a chain of command. He saw our approach and called out with the confident authority of someone whose faith in hierarchy remained intact. Identify yourselves by unit and rank. You are required to integrate with this formation under my command. We stopped perhaps 50 meters away, far enough to withdraw if necessary. The engineer called back, "We're deserters, Captain. We don't follow orders anymore. Orders get you killed. That is cowardice and insubordination. You will comply with military authority, or you will be detained and remanded to proper authorities for court-martial." What proper authorities? The command structure is destroyed. Everyone who followed orders is dead. You're out here because you ran, same as us. The captain's face showed genuine confusion, as if he'd never questioned why he'd survived when so many others hadn't, as if the cognitive dissonance between his situation and his beliefs was too vast to process. We withdrew to regroup. We are establishing a position from which to counterattack. We are maintaining military discipline because without discipline we are no better than the enemy. I could see his formation, see the careful positioning, the organized structure, the predictable arrangement of forces according to standard defensive doctrine. I could see that his position was exposed to the ridgeline 300 meters north, that his sentries were posted at regulation intervals, that his command post was in the most protected, most obvious, most targetable location. "Your position is compromised," I called out. "You're visible from that ridgeline. You're arranged according to doctrine. The enemy knows exactly where to attack. We are defending properly. We are following." He stopped, the word catching in his throat, the recognition finally dawning that following had become synonymous with dying. His expression showed the complete collapse of a worldview, the shattering of belief that had sustained him through years of service. What else can we do? Without orders, without structure, what are we? Alive, the engineer said quietly. We can be alive. The captain looked at his formation, at the soldiers who'd gathered under his authority, at the military precision that he'd imposed on chaos because precision was all he knew. Then he looked back at us, his face showing a desperate need for someone to tell him what to do, how to reconcile survival with duty, how to remain a soldier while abandoning everything that defined soldierhood. He never got to resolve that dilemma. The attack came from the ridgeline as I'd predicted. Heavy weapons fire that had obviously been pre-positioned, targeting solutions already calculated, the enemy having observed his formation and patiently waited for enough soldiers to gather to make the attack worthwhile. The defensive perimeter collapsed in seconds, 30 soldiers slaughtered with mechanical efficiency, their careful positioning having transformed them into a convenient target array. We ran, scattered, survived, because we'd maintained distance and hadn't integrated into his predictable formation. Behind us, the weapons fire continued for perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped, the enemy apparently satisfied that they'd eliminated the organized resistance and uninterested in pursuing scattered individuals who presented no collective threat. We regrouped 2 kilometers away, our number reduced to 8 now, 3 having been caught in the edge of the fire pattern or simply lost in the scramble. No one spoke for several minutes, the only sounds our harsh breathing and the distant settling noises of what had been a formation of Imperial soldiers and was now just scattered meat and broken weapons. "How many times?" someone finally asked. "How many times have we seen this? How many groups following orders, establishing positions, maintaining discipline, all of them dead?" "All of them," the engineer said, "every time. Perfect correlation. Follow orders, die. Break orders, survive. We've seen the pattern repeated enough that it's not coincidence, it's causation." "Then we can never go back," I said, the words emerging before I'd fully formed the thought but recognizing their truth immediately. "If we return to Imperial lines, we return to command structure. We'll be given orders, If we follow them, we die. If we refuse them, we're executed. Either way, we're finished. The recognition settled over the group like physical weight. The understanding that we'd crossed some threshold and could never return. That survival had required abandoning not just specific orders, but the entire framework of authority and obedience that defined imperial military service. We were no longer soldiers in any meaningful sense. We were survivors who'd discovered that survival and service had become mutually exclusive. We continued southwest for another week, moving through wasteland that grew progressively more hostile, finding water sources that required careful filtration and food sources that required even more careful identification to avoid poisoning. We encountered enemy forces occasionally, avoided them through basic caution, and the advantage of having no objective they could predict, no position they could target, no pattern they could exploit. We encountered other survivor groups, some accepting our philosophy, joining us and swelling our numbers to perhaps 40 individuals, others clinging to military structure and dying when that structure made them targetable. We stopped trying to convince them, stopped trying to explain, just marked the locations of their formations and moved elsewhere because proximity to organized forces was consistently lethal. The war continued somewhere beyond our awareness. Vast operations involving thousands of soldiers, mechanized divisions, orbital support, all of it coordinated through command structures that issued orders and expected compliance. We heard occasional Vox transmissions, intercepted fragments of operational communications, learned through these glimpses that the campaign was going poorly, that Imperial forces were being ground down through a process that Command described as enemy tactical innovation, but that we recognized as the systematic exploitation of doctrine. The enemy had learned that Imperial soldiers followed patterns, that they could be herded and corralled. Through careful application of pressure, that standard responses could be predicted and pre-targeted. They'd transformed warfare from chaotic violence into a kind of harvest, reaping Imperial forces as they dutifully moved into kill zones and established defensive positions and waited for orders that had been written thousands of years ago and never adapted for an enemy intelligent enough to read them. Months passed. I lost exact count, time becoming measured in seasons rather than days, marked by changes in weather and the gradual improvement of the wasteland's ecology as military operations moved elsewhere, and vegetation began tentative reclamation. Our group grew to perhaps 60 survivors, then shrank to 45 during a particularly harsh winter, then grew again as spring brought new refugees who'd learned the same lethal lessons we had. We developed our own culture, our own practices, our own methods of survival that had no relationship to military doctrine. We made decisions collectively, rotated responsibilities, trusted individual judgment over institutional authority. We became something that no longer had a name in Imperial terminology, something that existed in the gap between soldier and deserter, between service and rebellion, between obedience and survival. I think about Captain Markov sometimes, about his absolute faith in the chain of command, his conviction that orders were inherently correct, and that following them was synonymous with righteousness. I think about how he died, following procedures, implementing directives, maintaining discipline until the moment that discipline killed him. I think about whether he understood at the end, whether he recognized that his faith had been his execution. I think about all the others who died because they were good soldiers, who followed orders with perfect precision, who maintained their posts and executed their duties, and trusted that authority was competent and doctrine was sound. I think about how that trust betrayed them, how their virtue became their vulnerability, how everything that should have protected them instead marked them for slaughter. We are 47 now. 47 survivors who learned that obedience was death, who chose insubordination over suicide, who abandoned every principle we'd been trained to value because those principles had become lethal. We are alive because we refused orders, because we violated doctrine, because we became something the Empire would consider worse than the enemy, soldiers who wouldn't fight according to their training. We are alive, which means we're needed for nothing, have no function in a military machine that requires perfect compliance to maintain its operations. We are the evidence that the system failed, that doctrine became obsolete, that following orders was the fastest path to dying. We are the survivors, and our survival is itself an act of heresy, proof that obedience and death had become synonyms, that everyone who followed orders died first, and died fast, and died believing that their compliance was virtue rather than suicide. We are what remains when orders become poisonous and authority becomes fatal, and the only path to survival requires abandoning everything that defines soldierhood. We are deserters, traitors, survivors. We are alive, and we remember everyone who followed orders, everyone who trusted command, everyone who died because they were good soldiers. We remember them, and we survive by refusing to become them, by choosing chaos over discipline, independence over obedience, heresy over death. This is what we learned. The Empire's strength is its doctrine, its chains of command, its absolute demand for compliance. And when an enemy learns to exploit that strength, it becomes the Empire's method of execution. Everyone who followed orders died first. We survived because we refused.